Lucas Harper used to believe that if you worked hard and kept your word, a place would make room for you. Red Hollow had been that place once. It sat in a narrow mountain valley where the mornings smelled like pine sap and wood smoke, and the evenings carried the sound of creek water sliding over stones. Lucas and his wife, Evelyn, had built their cabin there with their own hands. No blueprints, no loans, just sweat and stubborn faith. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Rough logs, a tin roof that rattled in the wind, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. But inside it felt alive. Evelyn kept jars of dried herbs hanging from nails in the wall. Lucas had carved the kitchen table from a single slab of cedar. Every scar in the wood told a story of effort, of mistakes turned into lessons. They weren't rich. They weren't loud. They didn't complain. And for years, that had been enough. Then came the meeting. It was held in the back room of Miller's feed store, a place that smelled like hay and old coffee. The town council sat behind a narrow table, papers stacked like shields in front of them. A developer named Grant Whitmore stood nearby, clean boots, sharp coat, smiling the way people smile when they already know the outcome. The words were simple, cold, official. Your claim doesn't meet the new economic standards for the valley. Lucas felt his jaw tighten. Evelyn reached for his hand under the table. We've worked that land for 6 years, she said. Her voice was calm, but there was iron in it. We grow our own food. We keep the creek clean. We don't take from anyone. Whitmore didn't even look at her. That land will be used for cattle now. It's better for the town. Better for the town. Lucas wanted to ask who the town was supposed to be, but the room had already decided. They were offered a small payout and 30 days to leave. When they stepped back into the street, the wind cut through Evelyn's coat. Winter was coming early. You could feel it in the way the clouds sat low and heavy over the ridge. They didn't even argue, Lucas said. They didn't have to, Evelyn answered. They packed in silence that night. Tools first, seeds second, the old cast iron skillet last. The neighbors watched from their porches, some with pity, some with relief. A few turned away. As the wagon rolled toward the mountains, Red Hollow shrank behind them. The road climbed into rough ground where trees grew thin, and the rocks showed through the soil like bone beneath skin. Lucas pulled out a folded map his father had drawn years before. A penciled mark sat on the slope of the mountain, nothing but a note in the margin. Warm ground, possible spring. You really think there's something there? Evelyn asked. I think it's the only place no one else wants. She looked ahead at the gray hillside rising against the sky. Harsh, empty, unwelcoming. Then we make it ours, she said. And for the first time since the meeting, Lucas felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but something close enough to keep moving forward. The slope above Red Hollow looked dead at first glance. Gray stone pushed through thin soil, and wind bent the scrub pines into crooked shapes. No fences, no barns, no sign that anyone had ever tried to settle there. It was the kind of place people drove past without slowing down. Lucas stopped the wagon where the map's faint mark matched the ridge. He stepped down and pressed his palm into the ground. The earth felt different. Not warm exactly, but softer, less frozen than it should have been for late fall. Evelyn knelt beside him and touched the soil herself. It's holding heat, she said. Her eyes narrowed in that focused way she had when something practical clicked into place. Not much, but enough. They didn't celebrate, they didn't pray, they just started working. Lucas set the first stake for the entrance, while Evelyn cleared brush and stacked stones. The plan was simple: dig into the hillside instead of fighting the wind. Let the mountain block the storms. Let the ground hold whatever warmth it could. The first day broke their hands open. Pick against rock, shovel against packed clay. Muscles burned in places they hadn't felt in years. By sunset, the hole was barely deep enough to stand inside, but it was a beginning. That night, they slept in the wagon with the horse tied close for warmth. The wind howled across the ridge like it was warning them to leave. Evelyn stared at the dark slope and whispered, "People in town think we're crazy." Lucas didn't answer right away. "They thought we were useless before," he said. "At least this way, we fail on our own terms." By the third day, they were working like a system instead of two tired people. Lucas cut into the hillside at a slight angle, shaping a tunnel that wouldn't collapse inward. Evelyn hauled dirt out in buckets and mixed clay with dry grass to seal gaps between the first timber supports. When they hit damp stone, the air changed. A thin trickle of water slid down the wall and pulled at their boots. Lucas tasted it cautiously. Clean, mineral sharp, not bitter. It's a spring, he said, and it's not frozen. They carved a shallow channel to guide the water along the wall instead of across the floor. As it flowed, the space grew noticeably warmer. Not comfortable, but survivable. Evelyn unpacked seeds from a cloth pouch and stared at the dim tunnel light. We won't have sun. We'll steal it, Lucas said. He cut narrow shafts upward toward the surface, angling them just enough to pull in pale daylight without letting snow fall straight down. Inside, he hung scraps of polished tin they'd salvaged from broken lanterns. The light bounced weakly at first, then spread across the dirt walls like dusk that never quite turned to night. Evelyn built raised beds along the side where moisture clung to the stone. She mixed soil with leaf mold and the last of their compost, working it with bare hands until it crumbled right. Cold crops, she murmured. Kale, turnips, onions, things that don't ask for much. They worked until their bodies learned the rhythm of the place. Wake, dig, brace, shape, plant, sleep. From the ridge, the little entrance looked like nothing, just another dark cut in the rock. But inside, the space was changing. The air held steady. The water whispered along its channel. Green shoots pushed through soil that had never known daylight. Down in Red Hollow, smoke rose from chimneys and people said winter would be mild. Up on the mountain, Lucas and Evelyn built as if the cold were already coming for them. By mid-November, Red Hollow still believed in ordinary winters. Smoke drifted from chimneys at dusk. Store windows glowed with lamplight. Folks talked about snow the way they always had, like it was an inconvenience, not a threat. Lucas and Evelyn didn't share that comfort. Up on the ridge, their underground shelter had begun to feel like a living thing. The stone walls stayed cool but steady. The spring traced its quiet path along the channel Lucas had carved, and the air never dropped into the sharp, biting cold that ruled the surface. Their first crops had come in thin but proud. Small bunches of kale, stubby turnips, onions no bigger than fists. Not much, but enough to prove the ground could feed them. Then the sky changed. It happened over a single afternoon. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, the color of bruised steel. The wind fell silent, which felt wrong all by itself. Evelyn stood at the entrance and watched the light fade early, her breath fogging the air. This isn't a normal front, she said. The storm hit that night. Snow didn't fall. It arrived. Sheets of white drove sideways across the ridge, bearing trees, swallowing the trail they had carved down the slope. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like the world had cracked open. By morning, drifts pressed against the entrance like frozen waves. Inside the shelter, the sound was distant, muffled and low, as if the mountain were breathing around them. Their lanterns cast soft amber light over the garden beds. The water in the channel steamed faintly where it met the colder air. Lucas checked the vent shafts every few hours, knocking ice loose from the grates. Evelyn wrapped their crops in extra cloth at night and cooked thick soups from roots and dried meat. We're holding, she said on the third day. Above them, Red Hollow was not. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow. Windows cracked from the cold. The big cattle barn on the valley floor, new and wide and proud, collapsed in the night with a sound like thunder. Livestock froze where they stood. Food stores turned to stone inside their jars. People crowded around stoves that couldn't warm the corners of their own rooms. The storm didn't move on. It stayed. Days stacked on days until time lost its edges. 19 straight nights of wind and white. The town burned through wood, then furniture, then fences. Hunger crept in, slow and quiet, the way it always does. On the ridge, Lucas and Evelyn lived in a different world. The temperature in their shelter stayed just above 50. Their breath didn't sting. Their water didn't freeze. They worked their small routine like it was law. Tending plants, drying clothes, keeping the vents clear, cooking what little they had with careful patience. One evening, Evelyn sat on the low bench near the beds and stared at the green leaves pushing up through dark soil. They said we were useless, she said. Lucas shaved curls of wood from a broken handle, shaping a new one by lantern light. They said a lot of things. They said this wouldn't work. He looked at the walls, at the quiet water, at the steady glow of their lamp. They were wrong. Silence filled the space between them. Not empty, but full. Full of heat. Full of work. Full of the strange knowledge that survival had separated them from everyone they had known. Neither of them realized yet that the town would come looking. But above the shelter, the storm was finally running out of anger. And when it stopped, what it left behind would force Red Hollow to remember the couple it had pushed into the mountain. The storm broke without ceremony. One morning, the wind simply wasn't there. The snow stopped screaming across the ridge and settled into a heavy, blinding quiet. The sky cleared to a hard blue and the cold stayed locked in place, sharp and unforgiving. Lucas was knocking ice from a vent shaft when he saw movement on the slope below. Three figures climbed slowly toward the shelter, dark shapes against the white. One slipped and fell to a knee. Another stopped to cough, bent forward like the weight of the cold had finally reached his lungs. Evelyn came up beside him. "People?" They waited at the door, lantern in hand. The knock came weak and hollow against the thick wood. When Lucas pulled the bar and opened it, warm air spilled out into the frozen dusk like something alive. The men standing there looked older than they should have. Beards crusted with frost, cheeks sunken, eyes too bright from hunger. One of them was Tom Riley, a farmer who had voted at the meeting. "We thought you were dead," Tom said. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Evelyn stepped forward first. "You're freezing. Come inside." They hesitated like men unsure whether they deserved the heat. Then they crossed the threshold. Inside, the lantern light revealed green leaves in the beds and steam rising from a pot on the stove. The men stared, silent. One of them sat down hard on the bench and covered his face with both hands. "The town is breaking," Tom said after he could speak again. "The barn collapsed. Food's gone. People are not making it." Lucas felt something twist in his chest. "Why come here?" Tom looked up. "Because someone saw smoke." For a long moment, no one spoke. The past hung in the air between them like frost. "You signed the paper," Lucas said quietly. Tom nodded. "I did." Evelyn touched Lucas's arm. "And now they're here." He knew what she meant. This was the place where anger could turn into a wall, where he could say no and be right. Instead, he said, "We'll make space." Word spread faster than the cold. The next day, more people came. Mothers pulling children on sleds, old men leaning on sticks. Faces Lucas recognized and some he didn't. The shelter filled with breath and movement and the sound of boots on packed earth. Evelyn organized the beds so they could harvest without killing the roots. She showed the women how to cut leaves instead of pulling plants. Lucas taught the men how to set snares near the warm vents where rabbits still moved. When Grant Whitmore arrived, he looked nothing like the man from the meeting. His coat hung loose on his frame. His eyes wouldn't meet Lucas's. "I don't have the right to ask," Whitmore said, "but I will." Evelyn answered before Lucas could. "You're cold. That's enough." No one spoke of land. No one spoke of papers or signatures. They spoke of work. Days passed in a strange rhythm. Outside, Red Hollow lay buried and silent. Inside the mountain, people learned to share air and food and effort. The shelter wasn't comfortable anymore. It was crowded and loud and smelled of wet wool and boiled roots. But it was alive. One night, after everyone had settled, Lucas and Evelyn sat near the wall where the stone still held warmth. "They took our place," Lucas said, "and now they're living in it." Evelyn looked at the shadows moving across the ceiling. "Maybe that's what makes it a home." Above them, the ridge held steady. Below them, a town learned what it meant to survive together. When the thaw finally came, it didn't arrive with warmth. It came with silence. The wind loosened its grip first. Then the snow began to sink into itself, collapsing into heavy, slushy banks. For the first time in weeks, daylight reached the valley floor of Red Hollow again. What it revealed looked nothing like the town people remembered. Roofs had caved in. Fences lay flat against the ground. The road was a scar of mud and ice. The barn that once stood as a symbol of wealth and certainty was nothing but broken beams and frozen shadows. No one wanted to go back. Instead, people stayed near the ridge, near the shelter that had kept them alive. They built small cabins into the slope, copying Lucas's angled entrances and vent shafts. They dug shallow channels for water. They planted coal-hardy crops in beds carved from stone. What began as survival slowly became routine. What had been fear turned into habit. What had been exile became a blueprint. Grant Whitmore sold what little he had left and used the money to buy tools for everyone. Tom Riley worked beside Lucas from dawn to dark, learning how to brace ceilings and guide water. No one gave orders anymore. They shared them. Someone suggested a new name for the place. "Red Hollow is gone," a woman said. "This isn't that town." They called it Stonehaven, not because it was beautiful, but because it had held. Years passed. Children grew up thinking hillside homes were normal. They learned to read the weather from the mountain instead of the sky. They were taught that warmth didn't always come from fire, and that shelter didn't always mean walls. Lucas and Evelyn stayed in the original chamber. The first bed still grew food. The water still whispered along the same channel. Their home became something people pointed to without touching, like a story made of stone. When Lucas died, the whole settlement stood in silence at the entrance. When Evelyn followed years later, they placed a small plaque into the rock. They built where no one else would. They shared when they didn't have to. The old valley below never recovered, but the ridge did. And sometimes travelers would stop and ask how a town survived a winter that killed another. The answer was never simple. It wasn't just the shelter. It wasn't just the mountain. It wasn't even the storm. It was the choice. The choice to adapt instead of run. The choice to build instead of curse. The choice to open the door when it would have been easier to close it. So here's the question for you. If you were in Lucas and Evelyn's place, would you have opened the door? Would you share your last warmth with the people who once turned you away? Tell us what you would do in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about survival, kindness, or what home really means, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Stories about people who lost everything and built something stronger in its place.